So thank you so much, Laura. So we're working on our stewed peas and lettuce today for History in the Kitchen. And
Yeah.
you're getting ready to chop your lettuce, which is curly endive, right?
Curly endive. So I'll hold up a little bit of it to the camera so you can see it just a little bit better. I like it. It's got all these fabulous frills on it. But this is a recipe that's very flexible. You don't need to use this exact one. In fact, you may have noticed in our recipe list that we listed a whole variety of different leafy greens you can use that will work with this recipe. So do not feel limited. The key, however, is we want something that's got this really firm, meaty stem to it. We don't want anything that starts out too loosey-goosey and already really flimsy, because as you cook it down, it's going to break down and become even softer. And so if you have something that starts out really soft and flimsy, it's just going to completely wilt. We want something that's got some body and oomph to it. So
what you're saying, Laura, is we don't want to be using a butter lettuce or a red leaf lettuce. We want things like romaine and radicchio and curly endive like this, something that is more hardy. And you may have noticed in the recipe, it actually calls for 2 cabbage lettuces. Cabbage lettuce in the 18th century. Do you know what that means, Laura? Did you get a chance to look that up?
I did not actually. So if you want to explain, I'm happy to
Sure.
Yeah, that's you.
A lettuce that forms into a head. So it looks like a cabbage rather than an open lettuce like those butter lettuces and some of those that grow in an outward fashion.
And people love their leafy greens in the 18th century. So not only do we have recipes for cooking leafy greens, we do have plenty of recipes for salads, and of course salad dressings to go with that. So it is not out of the question at all in the 18th century if you were to go visit someone that they might offer you a salad on their table. But some of their recipes look a little different than ours. They have a lot of different dressings. A lot of their dressings include egg. So it's sort of interesting how similar things are still different in the 18th century, even though they have bases that have survived quite a long while.
Yeah, one of my favorite 18th century salad dressings uses hard-boiled egg yolks, just the yolks, not the whites. And you mash the yolks into sugar and salt and tarragon vinegar and a little bit of olive oil, and it's so good. That one is Mary Randolph's recipe to dress a salad.
And as I'm coming up on the end of our greens here, you may not be able to see it off camera. I'm putting them in my cooking vessel, which is just a big old pan. You don't need a big pot for this. You can do it in a pot if you want to. That's absolutely fine. But we don't need it to be. You may be thrown off by the title being stewed. We're not making a super stew per se, but we are stewing the ingredients. So you can do it in a pan. You don't need to do it in a pot.
Right.
However, there is
stewed in the 18th century means cooked in a liquid, which might be water, it might be broth, or it might be hot oil. There's recipes for stewed chicken. And when you get to the actual, not for chicken fricassee, and it tells you to stew the chicken in hot oil. And basically this is one of the earliest recipes for fried chicken.
So I'm gonna do away with this bowl. I'm gonna do a little redecorating here, because now I have my big old pan full of greens. So I'm gonna put that on down, and I'm gonna go ahead and turn my heat on.
Do you wanna do your onion first, Laura?
That's true. I should do my onion before I go ahead and start cooking, because we'll need a little longer. And this is just a regular old onion. So, and of course, if you're doing an onion, you can save your skins for the compost pile. If you like to dye things, you can save the skin for making a nice yellow dye. So don't waste your onion skin. Hold on to it. Of course, mine now wants to be super stubborn now that I have an audience.
As Laura is working through her onion, if you have any questions so far, feel free to drop them in the chat. Now is also a good time if you care to shout a question out loud, you can unmute yourself and let us know verbally.
It's sort of funny, we had started mentioning a little bit earlier about preservation, the fact that the lettuce is fresh, but the peas can be dried and stored. And onions, another one of those things that they would be able to keep in storage for a long time, as long as you keep them properly stored. And so this dish makes use of several ingredients that may not all be fresh for harvesting at the same time, but through 18th century preservation methods, we can have them throughout multiple seasons, which is always really great, especially in an age before refrigeration exists as a preferred preservation method. So it's sort of interesting, as we look at menus from the 18th century, they are not limited just because something's not necessarily fresh. They do have ways that they find of extending the season of things.
One example, if people in the 18th century were using peas, wanted fresh peas like the ones we're using today, they were not harvesting them fresh out of the garden. It's too late in the season, but there are recipes for preserving peas in butter. Basically, the butter was clarified and then the peas were stored in there, removing as much oxygen and water from the environment so that they could keep them into the winter and have this fresh pop of green on really cold and dreary days. Now that might not have been accessible to everyone across all spectrums of society because it takes time and effort and supplies that maybe not everybody had. But for, say, Thomas Halbert and his wife Lydia, who were tenant farmers of the Masons, they might have been able to do that, having cattle on the property and a garden to sustain themselves.
All right, so our onion's cut up, so I am going to go ahead and add it on in here with our greens. And then we're going to add in.
That's a rough dice, Laura.
Yeah, it's a pretty rough dice. I like my onion a little bit chunkier, especially in a dish like this where it's all getting mixed together and the onion's not just for flavor. I prefer a little bit chunkier, but you could dice it really fine if you're not a big fan of eating chunks of onion. You could absolutely dice it real fine and small. There's not a right or wrong way here necessarily. Now we've got our big old bowl of peas, and these are frozen peas that we're using today. So we are making use of a modern preservation method. And they got, whoops, sticking to the bottom a little bit. Now they're all in there. Now this is really full right now, but the greens are really going to cook down, so do not worry too much yet. And then let me see, what's my last thing? So we have one thing that we are using today and one thing that we're not. So I have here some, how would you call this, Lacey? It's our broth, but it's
bouillon paste.
Yeah, so I've got bouillon paste here, and I'm going to add some water to it. So about a cup, and my bowl's about a cup size.
We often cook at Gunston Hall, but we cook for public programs like this on an intermittent basis. So a bouillon paste or bouillon powder is easier for us to keep in stock than, say, cans of bouillon or cans of broth, which take up more space in our storage areas. Of course, in the 18th century, this was something that they made and used very fresh. And you may have noticed, I believe the original recipe, rather than broth, indicates gravy. So if we come back over here to the recipe, sorry, my computer is giving me a little bit of a fit. if we come back over here to the original recipe, you can see that they're including gravy. And gravy to us today has a particular connotation. If I say the word gravy to you, what comes to mind? How about you, Laura, when I say the word gravy?
I know I always think of sort of the traditional dark gravy that you think of at like Thanksgiving, or sometimes white gravy, like the sawmill gravy that you get on biscuits and gravy. But those are the ones that I usually think of today in a modern context.
Right. And of course, as you know now, Laura, because we've been talking about it a lot lately, gravy in the 18th century was not necessarily that thickened gravy. It was usually a very flavorful liquid. In some cases, it was a sauce, but most cases they're describing something along the lines of broth. So that is why we're adding chicken broth to this particular recipe, but it does sometimes specify in 18th century recipes what kind of liquid. And they might have used water. They might have used a variety of other liquids, depending on what was available for them.
So now comes the long part of this recipe, which is where we wait and this is cooked. And it'll take about 10 to 15 minutes for this to cook down. Obviously, it has to come up to heat first. I've set a timer for myself just to help me keep an eye on it, because I find when we live stream while cooking, sometimes my sense of time gets a little bit warped. So always use a timer if you have it. Now, while this is cooking, though, we do have another step we can go ahead and do. Because in addition to having the gravy added to it, we're also going to add in a little bit of flour and butter, and that's going to help thicken it up at the end. And that makes it like a little more stew-like and a little less thin and watery.
We'll be angling more for a gravy like what we're used to as the end product.
So I'm just going to use this bowl again, and I just have a lump of butter. I think that's about 2 tablespoons roughly. Yep. It's not super important for it to be exact. You will find this is true of a lot of 18th century cooking. We are not picky. We do not need it to be exact every single time. And then
we have given you exact measurements in the recipe that we've provided for you, because we know that some people like really exact measurements.
Which is totally fine. It's sort of interesting, as modern cooks, we tend to prefer recipes that are very exact and give us really clear directions. And a lot of historic recipes just don't do that. They're a little bit ambiguous and sometimes vague, and it can be a little frustrating sometimes as a modern person reading these recipes, trying to sort of suss out what they mean. So for instance, I'm going to put flour in with my butter here.
I'll put all that flour in, Laura.
I'm not pouring all of this. Yeah, just dunk it all in. And instead, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to put in a bit, and then I'm going to start mashing this together. And so I don't necessarily need a huge amount of flour, but I'm really cutting it together. So I'm kind of starting off by smashing it with just a measuring cup, just to kind of help me break it up. But there's a couple methodologies to this. And in fact,
you can use a pastry blender or a fork, or in the 18th century, they called for cutting it together with 2 knives.
And I have not gained that skill yet, so I decided I was not going to try to do that for the first time live for you all. So instead, I'm just doing this method.
Maybe you should make me cook on camera next time we need to make a flour butter paste.
Yeah. Next time I do it,
Laura is mixing up her flour and butter. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, or this is a great time to shout them out loud. If you are so inclined, we would love to know what you're thinking.
In fact, I am going to switch over to a fork real quick. I think it will actually help me with. Try to tilt it this way so you can see what I'm doing.
And I've got a spotlight on the ingredients cam, Laura, so that's all big.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you. Okay. For those of you who have not joined us before, I have two cameras, one where I can look at you fabulous folks, and then one for the ingredients. And I cannot easily see, so I rely on Lacey to be my eyes sometimes. Now this is pretty rough. I'm not looking for a super fine mixture here of this butter because it'll melt once it gets added, but it just helps to get it kind of mixed up enough that when it goes in together, I'm not adding separately butter and flour, that it goes in together and it'll bind together really nicely. So
This is also a great activity if you've got kids cooking with you in the kitchen, because they do indicate that in some of them that you should roll it together into a ball. So literally, this is a great one to get the hands into, mashing up the butter and roll it into a ball, and letting them add it to the pan, which our pan is really full and it doesn't look like it started.
you may not be able to see it yet. I can hear it, however. I can actually hear it starting to go.
Nice.
So I'm gonna give it a little stir. It's still really full, so we're gonna do this real gentle. But I am just gonna move things around, make sure nothing is sticking. But I can start, I am hearing it start to go. And I have this on like a really true medium heat currently. And if we were doing this outside, or I shouldn't say outside, if we were doing this in a historic kitchen, or for instance, for a lot of tenant farmers, you know, their home is such that their house is 1 or 2 rooms, and one of the rooms is a main room that contains a hearth where they're doing all of this cooking. This is something that can be put on low and slow. You could put it on for a couple hours and just let it cook. You don't need to keep a super close eye on it. And that's one of the things that makes this such an attractive recipe for a lot of working class people, is the ability to just let it sit.
I mean, I would put my lettuce in for a couple of hours, but personally, because it would disappear. But you could let the peas and the onions cook for quite a while, fairly unattended, and then add your lettuce at the end.
Right.
Laura, we have a question in the chat.
Oh, fantastic.
Is your butter flour mixture and the descriptions, I'm assuming in the cookbooks, where you know you roll it together into a ball.
Yeah, I love this.
The question is that a predecessor to a roux?
Oh, I would say it is in the same family. So for example, you mentioned earlier, Lacey, doing a fricassee. So I have a really favorite chicken fricassee recipe, and that's exactly what the last step is. You make a roux. And yeah, it really is kind of in that same family. I don't know that I would use the term predecessor, but certainly, yeah, it's in that group of making a roux. Yeah, definitely.
In my experience, the concept of a roux where you add the butter and then you cook the flour is a very French concept. This method where we are putting butter and flour together into a wet pan is a very English concept. And we start to see the concept of a roux, the cooking of the flour before adding liquid, but creeping in as there's more crossover between French and English cooking. We're seeing roux come into English cooking and English cookbooks. Sometimes it takes the long way around and goes from France to the West Indies and then up into the American colonies in some of the cookbooks that we're looking at. So yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting, you know, mentioning the French influence. We do get a lot of recipes in these cookbooks that are, you know, something describes it as being in the French style. So you get peas a la Françoise, it's peas in the French style. And so it's sort of interesting how, yeah, there's definitely a distinction that certain things are a style that another, you know, culture is using, but the English are still incorporating that. Like Hannah Glass, who writes The Art of Cookery, which is just one of hands down the most popular cookbooks of the 18th century. She's their Betty Crocker.
Betty Crocker or Irma Baumgarten.
Or Julia Childs, you know, like she's really, you know, like way up there. And so it's sort of interesting that and her book is republished several times. It gets new editions, it gets recipes added. So if you look at later editions, it has different recipes added to it. And she actually starts to add in sections of recipes that they may have considered exotic, for lack of a better word. So you'll get a section where it includes things like curry in the Indian style. And so
you know what you're thinking about, Laura? You're thinking about that curry in the Indian style, that section that has the more foreign or exotic dishes.
Yeah.
That's Mary Randolph.
Is it Mary Randolph?
That's Mary Randolph.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting, like, you know, you do get this sort of interest in drawing in other cooking styles. People aren't only wanting to cook in the English style.
Right. And they are definitely like spread across cookbooks, and that's not to say that Hannah Glass doesn't have them. She absolutely does. It'll say in the Spanish way or in the French way. In a lot of these recipes across her cookbooks and others. But this other one that Laura was thinking about, and we do tend to mash these up in our brains together.
We look at them so much that they all kind of run together.
Like, which one were we looking at?
I've got just a Rolodex in my head of 18th century cookbooks.
Yeah. But Mary Randolph, she was a late 18th, early 19th century Virginia housewife, related by marriage to Thomas Jefferson. And in her cookbook, there is a section of clear dishes which are clearly influenced by other places. There's curry in the West Indian style. There's oyoveja, which I'm sure she pronounced something like olovea.
Yeah.
Or some not in that way, but directly appended to the title is in the Spanish way or a Spanish dish, in various renditions of that cookbook. So, and those are all clumped together with a really amazing dish called gumbo, which is just okra.
Yeah, and she even puts the okra and tomatoes in that category too.
Exactly.
Which is sort of interesting, you know. And so the 18th century is such an interesting time of so many of these foods being brought into first, you know, the English conscious, but then the American, you know, corpus of food.
Exactly.
I'm going to pause myself for just a second. So I don't know if you all can hear it since we've been chatting, but this is bubbling really nicely. And I actually do have steam rising up from it, which is great. This is why I'm not covering it, is I want that steam to come off. I don't want to hold on to all of the liquid in here because, as many of you may know, leafy greens are just a ton of liquid. It's water. That's what's in them, is just a whole bunch of water. And while we do want some water, we don't want everything. So leaving it uncovered is totally fine. Lets some of that extra steam off. So
yeah, I can see some of that steam coming off there.
Yeah, I turned up the heat just a smidge.
I think our
peas weren't such a big thing.
I think our peas weren't quite thawed fully, so it may be taking a little longer to cook than expected.
They were still just a little bit cold. They weren't awful though, so you can do them with your peas, you know, coming from frozen. But if you have time to thaw them and get them more to a cooler or a room, more of a room temp, that will cut down on your cook time. So. And I do want to just make sure that I give it a stir every once in a while. We don't want the stuff on the bottom, like cooking, and nothing on top cooking. So we're just going to gently, but I can tell you that the texture of this is softer now than when we started. It's not as soft as I would like it yet. We want it to be such that we could pierce it with a fork or a toothpick quite easily, without really having to push or hear that big crunch sound. And I know I'm not quite there yet. So I'm gonna let it keep going. But I can tell you that the pile is smaller than when I started. It's definitely cooking down.
Yep, we were at level with the edge of the pan when you started, and we're now down a little ways there.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask if anyone else had any other thoughts or questions. Laura and I can talk about 18th century food all day long, but we want to make sure we're addressing anything that you're curious about.
I do find this the really fun part about cooking greens is watching them shrink. It's very satisfying. It smells good. Like a lot of you may be thinking like, oh, I don't know how this lettuce is gonna like smell good when you cook this up. It's not like cooking cabbage. I'll tell you that. Like, I don't care for the smell of cooked cabbage. This, on the other hand, very pleasant. And we haven't even added in any salt or pepper yet. We'll do that later when we add in our butter and flour. But the onions smell really good. And I think that's kind of helping to balance everything out. And I can see, it's hard, I don't know if I can get it so you all can see, but there is a lot of liquid here in the bottom of the pan.
Oh yeah, we can see that.
Cool. And that is bubbling. So that is cooking quite a bit.
Doing exactly what it's supposed to.
And it's definitely softer, like when I push it around with my fork, it's softer to the touch. So in fact, I'm gonna pull out one of these stem chunks because that'll be the hardest part. Yeah, it needs just a little bit longer. Still had a bit of a crunch to it, but I think we're getting very close to the point where we can add in our flour and butter. Any questions?
Not so far. I am keeping an eye on the chat.
Fabulous.
Oh, I think we just got one.
Yes.
Ooh, hello from Normal, Illinois. Thank you for joining us. I am curious if there was any indication that 18th century American cooking was influenced by Native Americans. Yes, absolutely. In so many ways. One really amazing dish that actually incorporates elements from all three groups of people living in the colonies in the 18th century. I'm talking Native Americans, African Americans, and white Western Europeans, is a dish called Brunswick stew. Originally, it was made with squirrel and a variety of different kinds of fresh beans like lima, also corn, which come from Native Americans. And then, and tomatoes. The okra, which is used as a thickener in it, was coming from Africans who were coming to the colonies by force. And then the concept of putting this all together as a stew and sometimes trading it out with chicken and the spices that were added to it, that was coming from the white Western European influence. All of the beans that have made their way into white Western European cooking by this time are in large part coming from Native American peoples. People like the Masons were unlikely to have been eating what we today call black-eyed peas and what we made in our last session. Europeans, English people called them cowpeas. And that was, and that was
that name.
that's a West African legume. So, but things like lima and a lot of the pinto and other varieties like that were coming from Native American peoples. Corn, watermelon. Laura, what else? What am I forgetting?
Various varieties of squash.
Yeah, a whole bunch of different kinds of squash. Most of the squash that we're familiar with came from Native American.
I'm gonna add in, I was saying, while you're talking, I'm adding in my flour and butter mix, and I'm just gonna add it in on top here, and then I'll mix it in.
Yeah, so there is so much, and we see these things in these dishes in English cookbooks by the 18th century. So yeah, that's a great question.
I'm also going to add in a little bit of salt and pepper. This is like maybe a little less than a teaspoon. And I'm just kind of doing it over. In fact, I'm not even going to use that whole thing. I'm going to wait and see what I think of it.
Mhm.
And then I'm going to add in some salt. Ooh, that pepper smells so good.
That pepper and the butter starting to melt in.
Yeah, so I'm putting in a little bit of salt too now. And then I'm going to stir this all together. And here's the thing. I've added the flour in. If I decide, however, once I mix this up and it's cooked down for about 3 minutes, if I decide it's still too liquidy for me, I can just add in a little bit more flour and then get it to the consistency that I want it to be. So kind of like we said earlier, you know, we've given you measurements, but also you can make judgment calls over whether or not you think it is the consistency that you wish it to be. So if you want it to be a thicker gravy, you can put in more flour. If you want it to be thinner, don't put in as much flour. So, and you can see now those greens have really cooked down, which is awesome. In fact, I'm going to turn down the heat just a little bit more.
That looks great. It makes me so jealous. I can't eat it.
I know.
If at home, like me, you are gluten-free, you can substitute rice flour or cornstarch for the wheat flour, and it will make up in a gravy very well. I frequently do that when I'm making historic dishes that I would like to eat myself. Laura, we have another question in the chat.
Fantastic.
Was this a side dish or a main dish?
I would consider this sort of in a class of side dish. However, we do have dishes that are vegetarian stew soups that do show up as main dishes. So there's a recipe called soup meager that's really similar to this. And it's definitely considered something that people would eat at Lent. So if you are Christian, as many people were in Virginia Colony, they were Anglican, following the Church of England. And so there were times of the year that they were not supposed to eat meat. Having vegetable preparations like this were a good alternative. So it can be either. I would consider this to be in sort of the side dish. Sometimes they're called corner dishes, but it's not a hard and fast rule. And in fact, some of the recipes will tell you at the end, this makes a lovely side dish, or, you know, this is a wonderful corner dish. So some of them they'll tell you how you should serve it. Other ones, they leave it up to you as the person preparing it, where and how you want it to go.
And what Laura is referring to is...
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
What Laura is referring to with side and corner dishes actually refers to the position on the table in a household like the Masons. It's unlikely that, say, Thomas and Lydia Halbert, who I mentioned earlier, had the capacity to really set a very formal table. So the concept of what a side dish is has changed.
Precious.
They may have done it, yeah, and like it's the sort of thing too of there may be a certain time of year in which you're having, like Christmas time, you may have guests over, so they may be setting a more formal table than they usually do. But for their everyday dishes, yeah, they're going to tend to focus on having like
Precious.
one pot meal with maybe something on the side like bread. But yeah, they're not setting super fancy. Now I think this is done. This has really come together.
Amazing.
Yeah, and the texture, like I wish it, I don't know how well it really shows up for you all, but it has, I added a little more flour, you may have seen, so it does have more of a gravy-like texture to it. It's not a thin, watery face anymore. It's really soaked up all of that. So I'm gonna turn my heat off. And this is our
You have to
peas
taste
and
it,
lettuce
Laura.
stewed.
You have to let us know how it is.
Let me get myself a small spoon to try rather than like trying to eat with the big monster spoon. So, of course, it's very hot, so I'm gonna just have to. Trying to get like a little bit of peas and a little bit of lettuce. Oh, there we go. I think I succeeded. So I'm gonna let this cool for a second because I don't want to burn my mouth on camera. Yeah,
That's good.
oh good. Like the peas carry most of the flavor, I would say, but the onion is really there and the lettuce has a flavor, but I don't know how to describe it. It has a bolder flavor than it does when it's raw. Like raw lettuce is kind of watery. This has soaked up a lot of the flavor from the broth that we added, from the onion, from the salt and pepper, from the butter. Like the lettuce can grab all of those flavors, and so it makes it flavorful and enjoyable rather than just kind of there, if that makes sense.
Oh, it looks amazing.
Stir a little bit more so it doesn't stick.
Got just a few more moments left in our program today. So I just want to take a moment to say thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. We hope you enjoyed it. This program and our last one, Black Eyed Peas, will be up on our YouTube page shortly and on our website. And if you're interested in joining us again next week, we're making transparent pudding. This is one Laura and I are really excited about. We won't necessarily be able to complete it entirely in our 45-minute segment, but we'll be able to show you what your pie should look like. And it is a pie before the end of the program. So we hope you'll be able to join us next time for transparent pudding. We hope you had a lovely time today. We always love cooking for History in the Kitchen and other programs as well. And I just want to take a moment to let you know about some other upcoming things here with Gunston Hall. So as I mentioned, transparent pudding for History in the Kitchen next week. In just over 10 days, it is Bill of Rights Day on December 15th. You can join us on YouTube at 1 p.m. to learn 10 things that you should know about George Mason and the Bill of Rights. That'll be a 30-minute program on our YouTube page live. And we are partnering with National Park Service National Mall to talk about the George Mason Memorial there as well. Otherwise, programs like this one would not be possible without your support. We would love it if you would consider a financial donation or become a member here at Gunston Hall to learn about these kinds of programs at the very beginning, very firsthand. And we hope that you'll consider supporting us in that way. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.